The spiritual awakening you've been sold is a lie, not because awakening itself doesn't exist, but because what's being marketed as awakening is actually the opposite. Carl Jung discovered something that the entire spiritual industry desperately wants to keep hidden. Most people claiming to be spiritually awakened are more asleep than they've ever been. They've just found a more sophisticated way to avoid the actual work of consciousness. And the narrative they're selling you, that awakening is this beautiful, peaceful transcendence, is keeping you trapped in the very unconsciousness you're trying to escape. Jung spent decades studying what he called genuine transformation versus spiritual performance. And what he found was disturbing. The spiritual marketplace had created a counterfeit version of awakening that looked impressive, sounded profound, and felt meaningful, but was actually just the ego wearing spiritual clothing. People weren't transcending their psychology. They were using spirituality to avoid it. And the more awakened they claimed to be, the more unconscious they often were. Today I'm going to show you the 5 lies you've been told about spiritual awakening, what Jung actually discovered about real transformation, and why the version being sold to you is designed to keep you asleep while making you feel enlightened. Because if you're on a spiritual path and something feels off about what you're being taught, Jung would tell you to trust that instinct. You're sensing the lie. And what I'm about to reveal will explain exactly what's wrong. Before we expose the lies, we need to understand what Jung saw when he looked at the spiritual marketplace. He observed thousands of people pursuing what they called spiritual awakening through meditation, workshops, practices, and teachings. And he noticed a disturbing pattern. Most of these people weren't becoming more conscious. They were becoming more defended. They were using spirituality as the most sophisticated defense mechanism he'd ever encountered. Jung called this spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts, practices, and experiences to avoid facing psychological reality. Instead of doing the difficult work of integrating their shadow, facing their trauma, acknowledging their darkness, people were jumping to transcendence. They were trying to rise above their humanity rather than moving through it. And this created what Jung called the spiritual ego, possibly the most dangerous form of ego, because it believes it has transcended ego. The spiritual ego is what happens when someone adopts spiritual identity without doing psychological work. They learn the language, adopt the practices, cultivate the appearance of awakening. They speak about consciousness and presence and enlightenment. They radiate what looks like peace. They perform compassions and wisdom. But beneath the performance, nothing fundamental has changed. The same wounds are active. The same patterns are running. The same unconsciousness is operating. It's just hidden behind spiritual concepts that make it invisible. Jung was particularly disturbed by how the spiritual marketplace enabled this bypassing. Because there was money to be made in telling people that awakening was accessible, achievable, and beautiful, that if you just meditated enough, read enough books, attended enough retreats, you'd experience this glorious transformation into your higher self. This narrative sold. It made people feel good. It gave them hope. But it was a lie. The first lie you've been told is that spiritual awakening feels good. The spiritual marketplace has sold you this image of awakening as blissful, peaceful, full of light and love. You'll feel connected to everything. You'll experience joy and presence. You'll transcend suffering and exist in higher consciousness. And this sounds beautiful, which is why people believe it. But Jung discovered that real awakening feels nothing like this. Real awakening, in Jung's observation, feels like psychological death. It feels like everything you thought you knew is collapsing. It feels like the ground beneath you is dissolving. It feels terrifying, destabilizing, like you're losing your mind, because you're not adding something beautiful to your existing consciousness. You're having your entire consciousness dismantled. Jung documented that genuine awakening begins with what he called the confrontation with the shadow, coming face to face with everything you've denied, rejected, and suppressed about yourself. This isn't a gentle, loving process. It's brutal. You see your capacity for cruelty, manipulation, selfishness, unconsciousness. You recognize that you're capable of everything you've judged in others, that the person you thought you were, the good one, the spiritual one, the evolved one, was a fiction. This confrontation doesn't feel good. It feels devastating. Many of Jung's patients' experience in genuine awakening went through periods that looked like mental illness to outside observers. Depression, anxiety, ego dissolution, inability to function normally. Because normal functioning requires maintaining the ego structures that awakening is destroying. You can't awaken and stay the same. Something has to die, and that death is agonizing. But the spiritual marketplace can't sell this. They can't market awakening as psychological death, so they've repackaged it as spiritual birth. They've removed all the darkness and kept only the light. They promise you that awakening feels good because that's what you want to hear. But Jung would tell you that if your awakening feels consistently good, you're not awakening. You're performing awakening while avoiding the actual process. The second lie is that awakened people are peaceful and loving. The spiritual marketplace has created this archetype of the awakened person, always calm, always compassionate, always radiating love and light. And people perform this archetype beautifully. They speak in soft tones. They smile constantly. They project serenity. They talk about love and oneness and unity consciousness. And you believe they're awakened because they look how you think awakened people should look. But Jung observed that people performing this archetype were often the most unconscious people in the room. They were using spirituality to repress their anger, deny their boundaries, avoid their shadow. They'd become so identified with being spiritual that they'd created a new, more sophisticated persona. And this persona was harder to see through than normal ego because it mimicked enlightenment so convincingly. Real awakened people, in Jung's experience, were often difficult, confrontational, unwilling to play nice, because they had integrated their shadow, which meant they had claimed the parts of themselves that society calls negative. They could access anger when anger was appropriate. They could be fierce when fierceness was needed. They could say no without guilt. They could call out bullshit without apology. This didn't make them cruel or unconscious. It made them whole. They weren't repressing half of human experience in pursuit of some spiritual ideal. They could be soft and hard, gentle and fierce, loving and boundary setting, depending on what the situation required. But this wholeness looked nothing like the peaceful, loving archetype being sold. It looked real, raw, sometimes uncomfortable. And that realness scared people who were invested in the spiritual performance. Jung noted that genuinely awakened people often made others uncomfortable precisely because they'd stopped performing. They weren't managing your perception of them. They weren't trying to appear enlightened. They were just being authentic, which included all the messy, imperfect human parts that the spiritual marketplace teaches you to transcend. The third lie is that awakening means transcending your ego. This is perhaps the most dangerous lie because it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what Jung meant by ego. The spiritual marketplace teaches that the ego is the enemy, that awakening requires destroying it, that you need to transcend ego to reach higher consciousness. And people spend years trying to kill their egos through spiritual practices. But Jung would tell you that this is not only impossible, it's psychologically dangerous. The ego, in Jung's framework, is the organizing center of consciousness. It's what allows you to function as an individual, make decisions, navigate reality. You can't destroy the ego without destroying your ability to function. And anyone claiming to have no ego either doesn't understand what ego is or is lying to themselves and you. What Jung observed was that genuine awakening doesn't destroy the ego, it decenters it. The ego stops being the commander and becomes the servant. You recognize that there are larger forces, what Jung called the self, operating through you. The ego is still there, still necessary, but it's no longer convinced it's running the show. But here's the trick the spiritual ego plays. It claims to have transcended ego while actually becoming the most inflated ego of all. The person who announces they're egoless, who judges others for being caught in ego, who performs humility while radiating superiority. That's the spiritual ego at its most dangerous. They've convinced themselves they've transcended what they've actually just repackaged. Jung called this ego inflation, when someone identifies with the self instead of being in service to it. They have an experience of expanded consciousness and claim it as personal achievement. They touch something vast and conclude they are that vastness. They access higher awareness and start believing they're enlightened while everyone else is asleep. This is the ego wearing spiritual clothing. And it's more unconscious than regular ego because it can't see itself. Real ego transcendence, Jung observed, comes with profound humility. Because when you actually experience the self, you recognize how small the ego is, how little control you have, how much operates beyond your conscious awareness. You don't announce your enlightenment. You're too aware of how much you still don't know. You don't judge others for being asleep. You recognize that consciousness unfolds in its own timing. You don't perform awakening. You're too busy actually living it. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get true self-discovery. The fourth lie is that awakening solves your problems. The spiritual marketplace sells awakening as the solution to your suffering. Once you awaken, you'll be free from anxiety, depression, relationship issues, money problems. You'll manifest abundance. You'll attract healthy relationships. You'll live in flow. All your problems will dissolve because you'll be operating from higher consciousness. And this promise is seductive because everyone wants their problems solved. But Jung discovered that awakening doesn't solve your problems. It complicates them. Because now you're seeing clearly all the ways you created your problems, all the unconscious patterns you've been running, all the self-deceptions you've been maintaining. And that clarity demands change, demands that you face what you've been avoiding, leave what needs to be left, transform what needs transforming. And all of that is harder, not easier, than staying asleep. Jung observed that people often became more distressed after genuine awakening experiences, not less. Because ignorance is comfortable, unconsciousness is safe. When you don't see the dysfunction in your relationships, you can stay in them. When you don't recognize how your career violates your values, you can continue. When you're not aware of your patterns, you can keep repeating them. But awakening strips away that protective blindness. And then you have to act on what you see, or live in the torture of seeing truth while betraying it. This is why many people unconsciously choose to stay asleep, or they pursue the false awakening being sold, the one that promises peace without requiring change. They want the spiritual high without the psychological honesty. They want to feel enlightened without actually transforming, and the spiritual marketplace gives them exactly that. A version of awakening that feels meaningful while demanding nothing difficult. Real awakening, Jung emphasized, is the beginning of work, not the end of it. You see yourself clearly, which means you see what needs to change. You recognize your patterns, which means you have to break them. You understand your complicity in your suffering, which means you can't play victim anymore. You're awake. And being awake in a sleeping world, in a life you built while asleep, is extraordinarily difficult. The fifth lie is that there's a destination called awakened. The spiritual marketplace creates this binary. You're either asleep or awakened, unconscious or conscious, unenlightened or enlightened. And people pursue awakening as if it's a state you reach and then maintain forever. As if one day you'll have the big experience, the profound realization, and from that point forward, you'll be awakened. And the spiritual marketplace reinforces this by pointing to teachers and gurus who claim to have reached this permanent state. But Jung observed that consciousness doesn't work this way. There's no permanent awakened state. There are moments of expanded awareness followed by contractions, periods of clarity followed by confusion, times when you see deeply followed by times when you're blind again. Consciousness fluctuates, and anyone claiming to be permanently awakened is either lying or unconscious of how much they're still not seeing. Jung described individuation, his term for psychological development, as a lifelong process, not a destination. You're always integrating more shadow, recognizing more patterns, seeing more clearly. But you never arrive at a place where the work is done. There's always another layer, always more to see, always deeper to go. The moment you think you've arrived, you've stopped moving. And stopping is how you fall back asleep. Real awakening in Jung's framework is the recognition that you'll always be waking up. That consciousness is an ongoing process, not an achievement to claim. That you'll spend your life moving between awareness and unconsciousness, integration and fragmentation, clarity and confusion. And that's okay. That's the human experience of consciousness. There's no escape from it into some permanent enlightened state. But the spiritual marketplace can't sell process. They need to sell outcomes. They need to promise you that if you follow their teachings, do their practices, pay for their programs, you'll reach awakening. And once you're there, you'll be fixed, finished, complete. This is the lie that keeps you consuming spiritual products while never actually transforming. Jung would tell you to be suspicious of anyone selling permanent awakening, of teachers who claim they've arrived, of systems that promise you'll reach enlightenment in some specified time frame. These are signs you're being sold the counterfeit version. The version that feels good but changes nothing. The version that lets you perform spirituality while avoiding the actual work of becoming conscious. So, what does real awakening look like according to Jung? It's not what they're selling. It's messy, difficult, often ugly. It's confronting your shadow and integrating qualities you'd rather deny. It's facing how unconscious you've been and taking responsibility for the damage you've caused. It's dismantling your persona and discovering you don't know who you are underneath it. It's recognizing patterns you've been running your entire life and doing the painful work of breaking them. Real awakening strips you of illusions, including the illusion that you're special, evolved, or enlightened. It humbles you by showing how much you don't know, how unconscious you still are, how much work remains. It isolates you because you can't engage in the performances that most relationships require. It demands everything while promising nothing except truth. And truth, as Jung observed, is often the last thing people actually want. This is why most people choose the lie, because the lie feels better. It lets you feel spiritual without being uncomfortable. It gives you community with other performers. It provides identity as the awakened one. It promises that you're special, chosen, evolved. And all of that is easier than the actual work of consciousness. But some people can't choose the lie. Something in them rejects the performance, sees through the marketplace, recognizes the counterfeit. And if you're one of those people, if something in you has been rejecting what you've been taught about awakening, Jung would tell you that your instinct is correct. You're sensing that something is off. And what's off is that you're being sold a lie designed to keep you comfortable while making you feel enlightened. Real awakening is available, but it's not what they're selling. It's not a product, not a program, not a state you achieve. It's a process of psychological honesty so brutal that most people can't sustain it. It requires facing everything you've been avoiding, acknowledging everything you've been denying, integrating everything you've been rejecting. It demands that you stop performing and start being real, even when real is uncomfortable, unpopular, or difficult. Jung called this individuation, becoming who you actually are rather than who you've been pretending to be. And it's the hardest work a human can undertake. There's no guidebook that makes it easy, no practice that shortcuts the process, no teacher who can do it for you. It's you, alone, facing your own psyche, and choosing honesty over comfort again and again until honesty becomes natural. This is what the spiritual marketplace doesn't want you to know. Because if you understood that real awakening is available through psychological honesty rather than spiritual products, they'd lose their customers. If you recognize that consciousness comes from shadow work rather than light work, they couldn't sell you transcendence. If you saw that the path is through your humanity rather than above it, the entire industry would collapse. So, they keep selling the lie, and millions keep buying it, and everyone performs awakening together while remaining fundamentally asleep. And the rare individuals who actually wake up are labeled as negative, unspiritual, caught in ego, because their realness threatens the collective performance. Comment below, I choose truth if you're ready to stop performing and start being real. Like this video if Jung's framework revealed the lie you've been sensing. Subscribe for more content that exposes spiritual bypassing rather than enabling it. The spiritual awakening you've been sold is designed to keep you asleep while making you feel enlightened. It's a product, not a process. A performance, not a transformation. A lie that feels good rather than a truth that demands everything. And the longer you pursue the counterfeit version, the further you get from real consciousness. Jung spent his life showing people the difference between spiritual performance and psychological honesty, between claiming awakening and doing the work, between looking enlightened and being conscious, and he concluded that most people, when offered the choice, would choose the performance. Because performance is easier. It gets you the rewards without requiring the work. But some people can't choose performance. Something in them demands truth, even when truth is uncomfortable, even when it means seeing themselves clearly, even when it requires facing everything they've been avoiding. If you're one of those people, if you've been rejecting the spiritual marketplace's promises because something felt off, that rejection is the beginning of real awakening. Not awakening to some higher consciousness, awakening to reality, to yourself as you actually are, to the work that consciousness actually requires, to the truth that there's no enlightened destination, just ongoing honesty, to the recognition that being human and being conscious aren't opposites. Consciousness is found through your humanity, not despite it. Welcome to the uncomfortable truth about spiritual awakening. Welcome to the recognition that what you've been sold is counterfeit. Welcome to the choice between continuing the performance or beginning the real work. One path is popular, comfortable, community approved. The other is lonely, difficult, and demands everything. Jung believed that most people would choose the first path, but a few would choose the second, and those few would actually wake up. The spiritual awakening they're selling you is a lie, but real awakening is possible. It just looks nothing like what they promised, and it costs everything you thought you were to discover who you actually are. That's the choice. That's always been the choice. And now you know what you're actually choosing between. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises, inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.